Bonjour, hi, I'm Denis Gagne from Trisotech, and welcome to today's webinar.
And I'm John Svribely, the CMIO at Trisotech. And the topic today is process automation in telemedicine with a focus on reducing risks. Next slide, please. Okay, next slide, please. This is the third in the series. The two previous webinars are listed here. One was improving efficiency in telemedicine. The second was in improving patient care. We'd like to give a little pearl for each webinar, and the pearl in the first one was the concept of attended tasks and how that can help in a physician interaction with the model. The second pearl would be for the linkage between concept maps and DMN and BPM models, which can improve explanation and understanding of terminology. The pearl for today's webinar will be on FHIR Accelerator, and then the fourth webinar will be the Italian perspective on telemedicine. Next slide, please. Okay, our topic today is reducing risks, and risk is an integral part of healthcare. If you see a large number of patients, no matter how good you are, you always run a risk of making a mistake, and if you do enough mistakes, something will happen that's unpleasant. As far as telemedicine goes, it has the features of healthcare where you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. And next slide, please. When you look at the damned if you don't, the risks are related to the fact that in the future, not having integrated telemedicine system will just increase your organization's risks of financial problems when value-based care is accepted. The presence of telemedicine can reduce readmissions, detect complications before they get out of hand. You can help people improve their lifestyle. In general, patient satisfaction with telemedicine is very high, and overall, you can improve the quality and performance in the metrics which are essential to value-based care. Next slide, please. And an example of this would be in postoperative home monitoring. This is the concepts here are very much like the example we gave in the second webinar, where after a person is seen in the hospital and discharged home, you can do home monitoring to detect either early complications or problems way before they might otherwise be noticed, and then triage the patients accordingly. So remote monitoring becomes an essential part to evaluate the person in the postoperative home setting. It also has ramifications for post-chemotherapy and other scenarios. Heart failure, asthma, COPD, all these things can be improved by by home monitoring. Next slide, please. Now, many of the examples that people are using for telemedicine involve known patients. So you're doing chronic management of a comorbid condition. You're seeing a patient that's a regular known patient who comes intermittently into the office, can have sessions at home. All these people are known to you. They have an acceptable level of risk in dealing with them. However, as people push the boundaries of telemedicine, they push into areas where the risk may be significantly different. And it's very easy to go from a low risk to a high risk environment. An example of that is the completely unknown patient who's having an acute encounter. And next slide, please. And these are some examples of what could happen in the first time visit with a patient for an acute encounter over using telemedicine. You may have never seen the patient before, and you may never ever see them again. The patient has no relationship with you. You have no relationship with them other than this episode. So the patient has no loyalty to you to speak of. The amount of information you have is sometimes very limited. The risk factors the patient has may be obscure or unknown. The amount of time you have to get up to speed, to get to know the patient, to find out their past history and stuff is somewhat limited. And then follow-up could be very limited or involve other physicians or providers that you have no knowledge of. So this takes you out of the realm from the known to the unknown. Next slide, please. Okay, how can telemedicine risk be mitigated? One is to be sure that you've got good documentation, and that means both what you're reading is well documented, but also what you provide is clearly documented. And so that involves having clear processes in place to ensure that the documentation you have is as good as it can get. You also need good handoff processes where when you accept a patient or you hand off a patient to someone else, responsibilities are clearly defined. And indeed, the failure to have good handoff processes is a significant area for problems and malpractice. You can also develop processes that in an automated fashion will find a pattern of changes, clinical findings, laboratory findings that can detect early warnings of a problem. These are often referred to as red flag type findings. And then finally, you want to get as much data as you possibly can as soon as possible. And a key area for that is the patient summary, which we'll get back to a little bit later on. Next slide, please. Our second example, which we'll use for our demo, is the area for dyspepsia. Dyspepsia is one of those symptoms that everyone knows but no one can define, which basically is a upset stomach, indigestion, feeling of bloating, feeling of fullness, can vary over time for the person between people. So it's a real nebulous type term. Most of the time, it's somewhat innocuous. It's something a person ate something wrong or it's not that bad. But occasionally, it may be a sign that something more serious is going on. So the question is, how can you protect yourself against this uncommon hazard while not losing the efficiencies in your process? Next slide, please. Okay, let's jump back to the patient summary. And the patient summary is defined here. And many organizations have all supported the concept of the International Patient Summary. Medicare, ONC, HL7, WHO all have worked on a standardized, short summary that is especially agnostic, condition independent, and has all the core information that you need. So if a patient shows up, if you can read this summary, you can know everything that is going on with the patient. Next slide, please. And when you look at the key elements for that, there's medications, type of allergies, clinical problems, and the problem list is probably one of the most important things, history of immunizations, laboratory results, procedures that have been performed. And all these things are presented in a standardized form. While the work has been going on for some time, it's not fully implemented in certain areas, but it is something that if you want to mitigate your risk in telemedicine, it's a priority that this be accessible to you. Next slide, please. And I believe this goes over to you, Denis.
Okay, thank you, John. So let me talk a little bit about doing a little bit introduction to business process automation. So in previous webinar, in webinar 1, we introduced the BPM Plus Health community of practice. BPM Plus Health is a community of practice that anybody interested in the topic can join. You can just go at the URL at the bottom there, www.bpm-plus.org. And this community of practice is really meant to foster and promote the use of shareable pathways, shareable clinical pathways, automatable clinical guidelines, and other healthcare type of knowledge. Trisotech is a founding member of this organization, and we invite you to join there. One of the marquee piece of information is the field guide to shareable clinical pathways that you can download from the site there. So let's set up a little bit more terminology for those of you that are new and didn't attend the previous webinars. So two of the concepts that we're really interested in here is the notion of workflow automation and decision automation, where the workflow automation is really the technology to orchestrate the various activities and enable us to react to various events that are happening while we're doing this workflow automation. While the decision automation is the technology that enables the automated decision based on the data that is available. Now, both the workflow and the decision can be with human in the loop or without human in the loop. So it's up to the modeler to decide whether this task needs to be confirmed before it's taken, or this decision the data provided to the decision needs to be confirmed, or the result of the decision needs to be confirmed. We have all the flexibility to do these things. Now, we're using a set of standards here in the BPM Plus Health based on the Object Management Group Open Standards, particularly DMN, BPMN, and CMMN. DMN being the decision model annotation, where we're going to capture decision and the logic of the decision. BPMN, the business process model annotation, where we're capturing the sequence of activities to be taken. And CMMN, the case management model annotation, where we're going to have the declarative structure of reacting to event in an event condition action type of presentation. Now, all three of these standards share the fact that they are visual graphical standards. In the second webinar, we introduced the fact that this BPM Plus series of standards come and augment what already exists in healthcare with the HL7 standards, namely FHIR, CDS Hook, and others, CQL. And as this pictures is showing, starting from the far end, we start with all our data sources, the EMRs, the device, the wearables, and all this data we want to aggregate it. And then we add on FHIR. By adding FHIR, we obtain computable data. And this computable data has the notion of common schemas, identity, and medical. And we can all use that together to provide us data automation. Now, sometimes data automation is not enough, and we want to add more. And that's where CDS Hook comes in, and CDS Hook provides the clinical context to this data. So when we have data in context, we have what we normally know as information, and that enables us to do information automation with the metadata and the context and the event awareness that we have from that context. Now, having that information automation is nice, but sometimes we need to go further and we want to do workflow and decision automation. And that's where the BPM Plus Health series of standards comes in play. And they offer the orchestration of that knowledge by adding the task and activities, the role and responsibility, decisioning, case management, event orchestration, and even adding AI, ML, and CQL, the clinical query language, into the mix to provide us with intelligent healthcare automation, which is our goal and what we're promoting here today. Now, in today's demonstration, we will show how we're starting from the models, and we will add a few elements like bringing in the concept, the terminology, and the rules, and the FHIR, what we call the FHIR Accelerator, to help us create these models that are fully binded to FHIR, and then we'll execute this from a what we call the CDS Hook sandbox, which is basically an emulator of EHR or EMR that connects to a FHIR server. In this particular case, the Smile CDR FHIR server from Trisotech partner Smile CDR. And I'll send it back to you, John, to take on the next portion.
Thanks, Denis. We're going to be now discussing the problem called dyspepsia. Next slide, please. Okay, in the last webinar, we discussed the use of the knowledge entity modeler And this is illustrated on this slide. When we look at dyspepsia, which we mentioned is a feeling of indigestion, there are a number of symptoms that are considered warning signs or red flags. And these are listed at the end node points in the concept map, which is the diagram on your left. These might be dysphagia, odynophagia, weight loss, abnormal bleeding, unintended weight loss. If a patient has any one of these things, they may be a reason to look at the patient more closely. They're not specific for a serious problem, but they just say, hey, I shouldn't just go through this patient quickly. I may need to investigate more. So the concept map shows the relationship between the various entities in the area related to dyspepsia. Up to the top right, we have the terminology explained. This is the vocabulary where each of the terms can be defined. It can be supported by evidence such as media or photos. And it shows the linkages for the concept. And then in the lower right, we have the possibility of rules, where for certain areas, certain bits of knowledge are known. And so these are one-line statements that basically describe the knowledge that you need to solve the problem. Next slide, please. And with this knowledge, we go now to the DMN and BPM models for dealing with dyspepsia. On the left, we have the BPM model, and we have data inputs going into it, which relate to unexplained weight loss and the 7 signs and symptoms that are all considered warning signs. This data feeds into a DMN model, and this is indicated by the little graphical sign on the taskbar to the left. And this indicates a call to a DMN model, which is given in the lower right, which takes those symptoms and asks which ones are present or absent and tallies them up. The evidence for the rules are established with a link to the rule base, and then the rules are based upon the clinical evidence, which goes to the references. And in the reference task, you get links to the papers. So in theory, everything from the source of the knowledge to its interpretation to its execution can all be captured. Based on the number of findings that are present, you can then decide, is this person low risk, intermediate risk, or high risk? If you have none of these findings, well, you probably are low risk. If you have one, maybe 2 of the findings, you're intermediate risk. If you've met more than one, then yeah, or other findings that might be of concern, then you're high risk. And so this is used then to triage the patient into one of 3 management paths. Low risk would be routine follow-up, nothing special. Moderate, medium risk would be maybe you need to head to a physical exam, have a clinical encounter. For high risk, you want to refer them to a specialist who can do decent work upon the patient. Next slide, please. Now, one thing that is the pearl for today's presentation is the Trisotech FHIR Accelerator, and this is the first of the slides to demonstrate that. A nice feature of Trisotech technology is that you can reuse things that you've developed in the past. This can be data objects, decisions, whatever can be reused. The FHIR Accelerator consists of a series of objects that also can be reused, and you basically just find it. You open up the FHIR Accelerator area, and then you find what you want to see, in this case an observation, and then you just drag and drop the object into your model. Next slide, please. And in doing so, you carry the data structure that is present in the observation. So off to the left, we have the definition for the observation where everything is described, but underneath that is off to your right, where all the features are there to make it FHIR accessible. And so if you fill everything out and publish it, you have a FHIR functioning entity. And I believe the next one goes to you, Denny.
Thank you, John. So let's jump into the demo part of today's presentation. So let me jump into the tool. So here I have my different model for this. In particular, we have the knowledge entity model that John was talking about, where we have the definition of the various terms here, and we're showing the relation. These relations are automatically generated from the relationship that are expressed in this diagram interrelating the term. So by that we get not only we have the term, but we have these what we call fact type about the term relating to the term. And a benefit of this is that we have the definition in there as well, so we can go from one another. And we also have a series of rules that we can write, and here is a series of rules on occult malignancy, and you can see that the definition are also available there. So everything follows within what we call the digital enterprise graph of Trisotech, where everything you model in any model is available across what your work is doing. So if we go back to this BPMN model, where we're showing the flow of activities that needs to take place, you can see that now the model is completely disambiguated with the terminology. By having linked the term to the knowledge entity model terminology, we have complete disambiguation of the terminology. And here we have the decision, and this is the decision model. And the same goes here. We have full disambiguation of the terminology. And if I go into the decision logic, you can see that this decision logic is a simple decision table that basically just tally up the number of observations that are positive. Now, the topic that we wanted to touch a little bit more on today is how does all this get tied to FHIR? So as a best practice at Trisotech and in general, it is suggested that you create what we call platform independent model, which is this logic here. It's a model that is executable on its own, but this model doesn't know anything about a particular context, a particular IT context or data context. And then what we do is we take this model and we do a wrapper, and this wrapper basically just calls this model, but with the particular context. And that's what I've done here. So here you can see that all this process does, it's a wrapper. It calls the model, this PEPSIA triage, which is the model I was showing here. And it basically calls it with FHIR elements. So you can see here that I have a FHIR dysplasia observation. And then what we do is we do a mapping from the FHIR inputs, all these observations that are FHIR observation, into the logical model or the platform independent model, which is these inputs here, by just saying, can we find one of these counts into the FHIR data? If we do, then we count it as yes. And then we write out to a CDS card, in this particular case here, a CDS hook card. So again, if I go and look at the mapping, on the output mapping, you can see here that I'm providing the elements, and those of you that are aware with CDS hook, you can see all the different CDS hook element, and I'm providing it some logic in there to go ahead. So what that does is it allows us to have a model that is platform independent. And then depending on my own platform, so maybe, you know, there are many places in Europe, maybe that FHIR is not all that present. Then they can create a wrapper for their own EMR or their own EHR, whatever is the case there, rather than a FHIR wrapper. Now, having done that, we can then publish this model. And when we publish this model, we obtain a service. And one particular endpoint of interest is the CDS hook endpoint service. So I'm just going to show you here. I have a CDS hook sandbox, which is basically an EHR or EMR emulator, where you can see I have access to my various patients. and their conditions. So now I can just go here, copy this hook service, add it to my EHR, and just save it. And now it runs the model. So you can see that for this patient, the dyspepsia severity is low, and it's giving me a series of recommendations. And this is through this model here, which calls this model here, which calls this model here, and comes back and then write the information. So there's a lot of activity really going on here at the speed of automation. And since I'm hooked on the patient change, if I change patient, now you can see that this particular patient has a medium risk. So the card has changed color to indicate this is a warning card as opposed to just an information card. And it's providing me some more information on recommendation of what to do. And if I move on to another patient, here I have a patient where the risk of dyspepsia is high, the severity risk is high. So we're giving you a critical clinical card there, CDS hook card at the critical level, which is reddish here in this particular implementation, to tell you to do that. So all this comes from these models. There is no actual programming or coding. It's just the assembly of knowledge that you do and then publish it to make it available to your system. And your calling system could be an EHR, EMR, or you could call these services from a phone application, you know, a particular, or a web application, or any other application where you could call these services. And that's all I really wanted to show you in terms of demo. Here, no need to go into the observation of the patient. So let me get back to our presentation. So in conclusion, we hope that we have demonstrated to you today how telemedicine has some inherent risk, and these risks can be mitigated. And risks are usually associated with providing that value-based care that we want to do that. When we mitigate this risk, we ensure that higher value care delivered. We also showed you how we can do automated detection of warning signs or red flags, and we can identify patient at high risk with the cards. You saw cards that show information level, warning, and critical level. We also introduced the notion of the international patient summary that can provide you access in the telemedicine environment, that can provide you the information you need to know about this patient that is the first time that you meet or see. And we showed you the BPM Plus health standard and how it can be combined with HL7 standard to provide you the right data at the right time for the right activity or decision.